For as long as I can remember, I've always loved mythology. It didn't matter which one Greek, Norse, Indian, Japanese. I devoured them all. Every time I learned a new story, I would run to my classmates, my parents, or just random people on the street to share my new knowledge. Looking back, my path was predestined. I would become a teacher and later a professor. When I received a coat labeled Stephen Marcheno, PhD in Classical Studies, I felt that I had succeeded. I had published moderately decent papers in moderately decent journals, built my network of contacts, and received recommendations from several respected colleagues. When I was offered a position at Brougham University, a private school of little renown, I was sure that all my efforts had paid off, but it didn't. While getting my degree, I met my future wife, a pretty dark-haired biologist named Victoria. While she was no Helen of Troy, she certainly had a significant impact on my life. Unlike me, Victoria didn't want to teach. She was attending university to get her undergraduate degree and leave, and biology turned out to be her choice. That didn't bother me. To each his own. We got along in everything that mattered, and she supported me in my goals. The decision to get down on one knee and ask her to marry me was the easiest thing in the world. We had our first child before I started at Brougham, and our second came in my second year of teaching there. The school had an unusual history. Not 5 years later, it was the subject of jokes, but an anonymous donor revitalized the university's College of Liberal Arts, renovated buildings, attracted young staff, and generally created a foundation around which the rest of the university blossomed. I use the word anonymous in quotes because his identity was known to all. Jeremy Stoll, a third-generation German-American and second-generation multimillionaire, paid for everything. Everyone knew it, though the reason for his generosity eluded even those of us who knew the name of the university's most generous benefactor. None of what he did fit the pattern followed by most wealthy philanthropists. Sometimes donors want to rehabilitate their family name, and Stoll could certainly use an update. His grandfather came here at the end of World War II as part of Operation Paperclip, a post-war operation to capture as many former Nazi scientists as possible before the Russians did. Stoll's grandfather, an optical scientist who worked on the Vampire IRNV infrared sight for the Stog 44 assault rifle, fit that definition. And as a Nazi, too. His family was one of the few old German clans to embrace Hitler's regime early on. Stoll, however, did not seem eager to rehabilitate his grandfather's name. Although a few buildings bore the Stoll name, they were far fewer than one might expect given the volume of donations. In truth, his funds, while significant to the revitalization of Brougham University, were a drop in the ocean compared to his personal fortune, not to mention the family wealth that Grandpa Stoll was rumored to have stashed away in Swiss bank accounts. There was also a theory linking his generosity to the death of his wife, an American heiress from a family with blood so blue that it may have contained cobalt rather than iron. Her death in a helicopter crash occurred less than a year before Brougham's heyday, which seemed logical. However, while her name adorned a medical research charity, it was in no way connected to the university, which sparked further speculation. Faculty members in the College of Liberal Arts hypothesized variously about the motives behind his generosity, from true philanthropy to remorse for his family's role in the Holocaust to some sort of elaborate tax shelter. Some faculty members didn't speculate at all, saying it didn't matter as long as the checks kept coming. Only later did I notice how many of my friends belonged to this select group. I joined the faculty under contract as a modest assistant professor 1996. The school had an excellent childcare program, and Victoria worked in the bursar's office for most of that time, almost never going on maternity leave. We were happy in those days. I was merrily moving up the career ladder, and she was able to earn a little extra money for our family while also finding something to do while working among the administration. If you had asked me back then, I would have said I was living the life of my dreams. I believed it, right up until about the June fundraiser of 2002, when my 5th year at Brougham was coming to an end. By then, my getting a permanent position was almost guaranteed. None of us liked to talk about it with certainty. Even the most rigorous logicians have their superstitions. However, gaining status was essentially a political process, and I had the support of those who made the decision. More importantly, I often published research papers in journals that, frankly, were more prestigious than my work deserved. Perhaps this should have been a wake-up call, but I was young and confident enough to just pat myself on the back in private. While I recognized my good fortune, I didn't quite understand its magnitude or the hidden cost of this supposed blessing. Victoria and I attended the fundraiser as required. Of course, the school insisted it was a voluntary event, but for someone on the cusp of getting a position, attendance was mandatory. We ate, drank, and danced while socializing with faculty, staff, and, most importantly, potential donors. I tried my best, but my wife seemed distracted. We sent the kids to her parents for a few weeks, and I hoped she wanted to leave as quickly as I did, and for the same reasons. At one point, as Victoria and I were moving around the dance floor, Stoll came up to us and asked her to dance. I didn't particularly like the man. Aside from his family history, he had a tendency to take over companies and ruin them. He was also, in many ways, something I was not. Tall, brutishly handsome, athletically built, and of course, rich. I won't deny that part of my dislike stemmed from jealousy, but something else about him, even then, made me uneasy. My wife smiled hesitantly, then kissed me briefly, and parting from me, murmured, "I love you, Stevie." Her manner made me uneasy, but I couldn't understand the uneasiness it caused. After all, she had never given me any reason to doubt her love for me. I watched in bewilderment as she took his hand, and they began to dance. Everything looked normal as they glided across the floor, no different than any other dance she had danced with other men since we had gotten married, but still something was off. I took a step toward them and opened my mouth to speak, but before I could do so, a hand grabbed my shoulder lightly. "Stephen." I turned and saw Charlotte Green, the vice president for university development, that is, the chief fundraiser. "I need to talk to you for a few minutes." I looked back at Stoll and Victoria, but they had already disappeared into the crowd of dancing couples. "She'll be fine, Professor Marcheno. I just need a minute of your time." Pushing aside my misgivings, I gave a strained smile. After all, getting a position was a political matter, and people with money could always find a reason to terminate my contract early. "Of course, Charlotte. Here or... no, somewhere quieter, I think." She invited me to follow her, and I did so, trailing a half step behind as she led me to the door that led us out of the ballroom and toward her office. I know that universities have a reputation for being bastions of unbridled progressivism, and I generally find that reputation somewhat unfair. In the business realm, however, it is greatly inflated. A young black lesbian occupying a board seat in the 90s was an enigma, almost as obscure as Stoll's donations, which largely went unnoticed, at least until the man connected all the dots. Charlotte was a few years older than me and had been involved in the Brewham revival that brought me to the school. Shortly before I joined the faculty, the previous vice president for development vacated his position, and Charlotte, a former Stoll employee, took his place. No one ever explicitly said he played a role in it, but everyone knew. When she first touched my shoulder, I thought maybe she just wanted to warn me. "It's just a dance. Don't make a scene." But that didn't make sense. Victoria and I had both danced with donors at previous fundraisers. Victoria had even we had even danced with Stoll, and while I didn't particularly like him, he'd always been a gentleman, dancing one song and then returning it to me, thanking us both. But it was different now. Those thoughts kept me on my toes as I followed her, especially since she'd chosen that exact moment when Stoll was dancing with Victoria to take me aside. We walked farther than we should have, Charlotte leading us through the corridors in a winding route that someone unfamiliar with the university might have taken, but not someone who had worked here for over a decade. Just as I was about to object, she smiled and said, "Here we are," and then opened the door in front of me. Inside, 4 men were waiting for me. 3 I knew well, considered them friends, each of them a professor at the College of Liberal Arts. All of them looked at me with a guilty expression, as if apologizing. A fourth man appeared for a moment before I felt as if I'd been doused with ice water. Stoll's bodyguard, Greg or Daniel or something like that. I'd only heard his name once or twice, and then in passing. I'd seen him in the ballroom before, but men like that are supposed to be invisible. No wonder I'd missed his exit, his impassive face, my friend's displeasure, and Charlotte's cold tone as she sat down took me from concern to alarm. She pointed to a chair across the table and said, "Sit down." "What's going on?" "Sit down. I'm not going to—" The bodyguard took a half step, but Charlotte raised her hand to stop him. "Sit down. Whether you do it yourself or Alex makes you, the result will be the same." Jordan Donato, professor of medieval history and the oldest faculty member present, spoke up. "Stevie, just do it." He took a deep breath. "Please. She's right. Nothing you can do will make the next few minutes more enjoyable, but you can make them a lot more unpleasant. Trust me." I considered confronting them, but like I said, I knew my weaknesses. I wouldn't stand a chance against someone like Alex in a fight, and that's not taking into account that Jordan and the others could help him prevent me from leaving. Reluctantly, I sat down across from Miss Green. Good. The warmth she'd shown earlier was gone, leaving a cold, calculating stare. "You need to realize a few things, and the first of them is that you have no choice in what happens next. I'm not saying this out of cruelty, quite the opposite. The sooner you realize that, the easier it will be for you, as Professors Donato, Abernathy, and Post can attest." "What is it?" "The culmination of your stay at Brewham. I know you think of it as gaining status and a long teaching career to follow. It's part of the plan, but more of a means to an end, at least as far as the university is concerned. At the end of the day, we are a business, and while the product we create is educated students, their tuition only partially covers all the costs. That's why we have sponsors, particularly Jeremy Stoll. He's the reason you're here." I frowned but remained silent, letting her continue. "I don't mean to sound dismissive, Professor Marcheno. You're an excellent teacher, and any school would be happy to have you. But," she shrugged, "the special qualities you possess mean you're a perfect fit for our program, and Mr. Stoll has made arrangements to get you hired here and put you on the fast track to status. For example, your papers find publication very easily, don't they? It's not that they're bad, but there are only a few slots vacated in journals every year, and you've never had any problems with submissions. Nor did you have to deal with the financial and time constraints of raising a family, like many young professors. You see, the university's chief benefactor believes that the world would be a better place if more people were raised in happy families and educated by qualified teachers like you throughout their childhood, especially if children have certain qualities guaranteed by their genetics. Although the jury is still out on this hypothesis, Brewham is happy to cooperate in assessing the feasibility of his beliefs. So it was in our best interest to make sure you had a happy, stable family life before you took the next step in your stay here." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "What's the next step?" "Mr. Stoll and your wife have come to an agreement that was mediated by me. I assure you she was reluctant to agree, but I made it clear to her that your family's future depended on her decision and your ability to come to terms with it. They went to the airport, where they will board his private jet and travel to another country. You don't need to know where exactly. The important thing is that Mr. Stoll will treat her like a queen the entire time. When she returns in a few weeks, she will be pregnant with his child. The two of you will raise that child." "Well, fuck you!" I jumped to my feet, expecting the stoic guard to rush after me, but he didn't even twitch. Instead, turning toward the door, I found Abernathy and Post blocking my path. If I tried to leave, I would have to fight my way through them. As I pondered my chances, Donato said quietly, "Stevie, I'm sorry. I understand how you're feeling right now, but look, you're not the first. You're not even the fifth. Please, just listen to what she has to say, and then I promise, if you want to leave, we'll fight him for you. He'll kick our asses, but we'll do it." Abernathy and Post nodded solemnly in agreement, with Abernathy even casting a glance at Alex. Green sighed, "No need for such machismo, gentlemen. No one here is going to kick anyone's ass." "What's the point of that, Professor Marchano? You won't know where to go if you leave now, and when I tell you everything you need to know, you can leave. The truth is that everything up to this point has been predetermined, and everything after that." "Well, that's why I'm here, to tell you how things are going to play out from here on out." "And how is that?" "As I said, your wife will return in a few weeks, pregnant with Mr. Stahl's child. You and she will raise it together as your own. You will remain married until the child comes of age, and Mr. Stoll will ensure that you are well compensated for this work. You and Victoria will be millionaires by the time you are 18, and until then neither of your children will need anything when it comes to their health, education, or other needs. And of course, Brewham will grant you the right to work. That goes without saying." I snorted. "Yeah, all I have to do is live with a cuckolded Nazi pervert." Her face contorted in a grimace. "I suggest you don't throw around such accusations, Professor. Mr. Stahl is no more of a Nazi than I am, and he won't appreciate such insults." Rolling my eyes, I replied, "Eugenics? Genetic foundation? Some kind of twisted nature versus nurture experiment? If it looks like a goose and walks like a goose—" The chief beggar interrupted my rant. "This is a pointless waste of time. What you think of him is irrelevant. What matters is what you decide to do next. If you agree to abide by the conditions, all of which are very simple, you will be rewarded. In fact, the conditions are so simple that I can tell you about them in one sentence. Pretend the baby is yours. That's all there is to it. When your wife returns, do whatever is necessary to soothe your wounded pride, and then raise the child as your own. Although you and Mr. Stoll have nothing in common, you are close enough that no one will guess that the child is not yours. Keep its origins a secret. Don't divorce, and live as if it never happened." "Unless that son of a bitch wants to sleep with my wife again, right?" "No. The terms are very clear. Neither you nor your wife can cheat, and that includes any further liaisons with Mr. Stahl." "He made that nonsense up. He can change the terms again." She shrugged. "Maybe, but he never did. I doubt he ever will. His goal is to create what he thinks are the philosopher kings Plato spoke of, combining his natural talents with loving tutelage, which he doesn't have the time or skill for. Family discord is not conducive to that goal." I slammed my fists on the table and growled in her face. "Then why do it at all? Why take my wife out of the country to have her? There must be people who actually want to have a rich asshole's child out of wedlock." Green looked at me coldly. "I've told you as much as I've been allowed to. You don't need to understand his methodology, Professor. You just need to follow the program." "And if I don't? If you don't—" She drummed her fingers on the table. "I assume you mean if you divorce your wife? Then you won't be able to get tenure. The same journals that used to be so eager to publish your research will turn you down for new papers. No 4-year school will take you. You'll be lucky to find even a teaching position at a community college, and none within a day's drive of Browham. Your wife will get the children, of course, and all of your family's property will be divided, at best, equally. If you try to make her infidelity a key argument in court, well, let's just say that Mr. Stoll's companies would be happy to provide you with legal services that would make your defense unbeatable. I'm sure you're not stupid enough to take it public. It would be, shall we say, career suicide." She emphasized the last word, and I glanced at Alex. He was smiling for the first time all evening, and a shiver ran down my spine. When Green finished her speech, I replied, "So, to be clear, my wife is flying off to some exotic location to sleep with another man. I can't divorce her, can't quit my job, can't tell anyone about it, have to raise the Nazi's child as my own, and my paycheck is seniority, some money in a couple decades." She tilted her head to the side. I wondered if I'd have time to snatch the letter opener and slit her jugular before the guard got to me. "Essentially, yes, but there are other benefits. Mrs. Marchano has agreed to do whatever you demand, within reason, to save your pride. For the next few years, you'll be given a certain amount of leeway in terms of vacations and the like. And it's not just some money, Professor. Mr. Stoll will provide the trust with sufficient funds to ensure that you receive substantial payments. Green stood up and looked at her watch. At this point, their flight has already begun. As I said, everything was predetermined from the moment you signed the contract to teach at Brewham. I thought something resembling sympathy or guilt flashed in her eyes, but I couldn't swear to it. I understand you're upset. It's a gilded cage, and I won't pretend it isn't. However, it is so luxurious that many men would instantly trade their lives for yours. I sank down in my chair and muttered, "Then why didn't that son of a bitch find one of them?" As if I hadn't said anything at all, Stoll's assistant pointed at Alex. "You're a smart man. I'm sure you'll make the right decision for your family and yourself." Rising from the table, she nodded to my 3 co-workers. "Your comrades have already made that choice, and they will be here to help you through the challenges. This is your new life, Professor Marcheno. It will require some adjustment, but overall, I think you will find it quite comfortable once you get over the initial shock." And with those words, she left. Post closed the door and sat to my right, while Abernathy took a seat on my left. Donato settled into the chair vacated by Charlotte's departure, and rummaged through her desk until he found a bottle of whiskey. He set it down so I couldn't reach it, and then took out 4 glasses, but filled only one and slid it toward me. Then all 3 of us sat down and waited. I drank silently, taking only a few sips. I could answer the obvious questions myself. Why didn't the others tell me? Because says Stoll would have punished them. How long had this been going on? Donato got the position the same year Charlotte became VP of Development, Post the next year, and Abernathy another year later. That gave me the first question I couldn't answer. "Where are the other 2? I asked. The men looked among themselves. "The other 2? Donato clarified. "You said I wasn't even the 5th person he did this to. It's been 6 years since Charlotte took her position. 3, 4 cuckolds, so there must be 2 more men." "Ah," Donato sighed. "The 5th is Thompson. He's not in a mental state to be of much use right now." Abernathy snorted. "As if any of us are Donato threw him an angry look and raised his hands in apology. "The 4th man is the reason we're here. That was Joe Franklin." I took another sip, pondering what that could mean. 2 years ago, Franklin had left the university after being accused of trading sex for grades by 3 female students. I didn't know him well, but even then I found the allegations hard to believe. He had never struck me as the type of person I was. That explains something. "More than you realize," Abernathy said grimly. Donato shook his head. "This is not the time for... This is the perfect time. I don't know why you're so unwilling to listen to reason. As if this whole situation isn't..." Abernathy sighed and turned to me with seriousness. "You have to realize that this isn't something you can't get out from under, and Franklin is a perfect example of that. This isn't just some sick, rich bastard having fun, although I'm sure that's what it is too. This is deadly serious, and Franklin was Stoll's lesson for all of us." The psychology professor, more enraged than ever, snatched the bottle from Donato and poured himself a drink. "Look who he picked. Patient, methodical people who love teaching but hate everything about it. This publish or perish thing. All about the same age, all married to women they met in college, all with 1 to 3 children. White, with blonde hair and dark eyes, so we can pass off his illegitimate children as our own. There are 6 of us, and we all fit that description perfectly. All except Joe." He tossed back his glass and continued. "He had a bit of a temper at times. Preferred research and field work to teaching. Didn't have any children. Married only a couple years. Black, so no one could believe Stoll's baby was his. Married to a white woman, though, like the rest of us. I think, though I can't be sure, that it offended Stoll, because he needed a man to set an example. He killed 2 birds with 1 stone. He deliberately chose a man who he knew would reject his offer and decide he could go his own way. And Stoll showed him that he didn't. Why not? He's gone, yes, but he can still do something else. Maybe not teach, but... Joe's dead. He killed himself a year ago. I know you didn't spend much time with him, but he and I used to box at the same gym, and I've never met a more determined man. There's no way he would have chosen that path." Stoll killed him. I'm sure of it. He hired someone to do it and make it look like a suicide. I can't prove it, but it doesn't matter. Even if I could, he'd get away with it. Guys like him never see the consequences of their actions. He refilled his glass and sipped again. But guys like us do. I've been thinking about this for a long time. I'd doubted before how much of Green's veiled threat was a bluff, but now I had no doubts. Regardless of Jost's reasons for choosing Franklin, it served as a warning to the rest of us. Perhaps the deaths of enough former professors from Brewham would spark an investigation, but who in their right mind would volunteer to be second in a trail that might someday lead to Jost? No one. At least, not me. This begged the following question. What the hell am I supposed to do now? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Richard Stoll turned to me and asked, "How did you cope with your father tricking you?" There was silence at the table. 23 years after that evening, everyone in the conversation was careful to avoid words beginning with the letter S, at least when it came to me. Victoria, who was sitting across from me, wouldn't make eye contact with me. Charlotte was busy studying her plate of mushroom risotto, usually a favorite of mine, though at this point I doubted she really cared. Jeremy turned to his son with an icy tone in his voice. "I've told you before, don't use that word. It's unseemly and rude. Stephen is our guest and my friend, and you insult him in our house?" The younger Stoll seemed to huff, but it was more because of his father's admonition than his own decision. "I apologize. Immediately." The young man grudgingly agreed. "I apologize, Professor Marciano. I meant no disrespect." Richard, who was named after his great-grandfather, emphasized my title even as he apologized, clearly trying to remind me of my position. I had become a professor, thanks to his father, and he, as the sole legal heir to the family fortune, had power of attorney over me. He was not unreasonable. After all, we had gathered at my vacation home that evening to discuss his first cook-holding incident with Professor Broham. I gave Richard a condescending smile. "That's all right. Your choice of words is perhaps crude, but you're not wrong. Your father, as you put it, tricked me." Jeremy tried to interject, but I waved him off. "It's all right, old friend. I accepted it a long time ago. The water's gone." The other four faces at the table exchanged surprised looks. Even Victoria, who had learned firsthand how hard it was for me to accept her act, looked shocked. It was one thing to remain silent about the rift she and Stoll and Green had caused in my marriage. It was quite another to speak openly, and even proudly, about my acceptance. Jeremy took the floor again with a tinge of disbelief and disapproval, despite his words. I chuckled. "Well, I don't know if you can forgive. Some things you just put behind you and move on." His son joked, "Move on or go crazy." Jeremy hissed sharply, "Richard?" I shook my head, smiling. "No, I never thought the idea of your father and my wife together could be erotic. There would be no willing cuckolds among our company." I shrugged. "Although, maybe Professor Martin. But he's always been some kind of strange bird." Jeremy chuckled, but the perverse tastes of my only colleague, who found pleasure in the thought of his wife sleeping with the elder Stoll, always annoyed him when I brought it up. Then I continued, "Jeremy, your son asked a perfectly reasonable question that may help him in the future. I know we usually limit business talk to the end of the meal, but I think we can make an exception in this situation. After all, this isn't about the business side of this transaction, is it?" While he pondered my request, I tried another spoonful of risotto. It was only my second bite of the evening, though the others had almost finished their plates. As host, I was careful to make sure everyone got their dishes first. Stoll's bodyguard, Alex the food taster, and then everyone else. For such a small group, that meant salad, main course, and dessert, followed by fruit and alcohol in the living room. Sometimes I felt a little clumsy, running between the kitchen and the table while the others talked. Victoria noticed me frown as I swallowed another bite and asked, "Is something wrong?" I held up a finger and took another bite. "Yeah, there seems to be something wrong. There's some kind of sour taste." I offered her a taste. She took a little and squeaked, "Oh, it's awful. Anyone else?" Everyone tasted and nodded. I'm sorry, dear. I'll get you another portion. No, it's fine. I patted my stomach. More room for dessert, and I can talk while you eat. Unless, of course, you don't mind, Jeremy. He nodded. I admit I've been curious for a long time, too, but I thought it was too rude to ask, especially since you've spent years convincing others to agree to the experiment and then the planning. I valued that commitment to your vision, and our friendship, for that matter, too much to question, but... Jeremy shrugged and spread his hands, not wanting to finish the sentence. That's very kind of you. However, given that Richard brought it up, I stood up, grinning to myself. I'm sorry, but I always get better lectures when I'm moving. The group nodded politely. As I said, it's a fair question, which will help you, Richard, to successfully play the role of cuckold for Professor Schofield. He laughed. I think I can manage well enough on my own. Jeremy growled. Richard. What? You say that like it's a big deal. They're all available, after all, and I don't see the point in worrying about their feelings. In response to his father's glare, he quickly added, No offense, Professor. The point, I said, is to make the whole process as painless as possible. Your father's experiment continues. The family raises the child, and everyone's life goes on. If that's your goal, the last thing you need is to make things even more awkward for the cuckold by emphasizing your influence over him. Charlotte and his co-workers will make it clear how little control he has over his future, I assure you. Anything more than that would be unacceptable. My smile, perhaps, or my words, made him frown. Understanding how the men your father cuckolded went on with their lives is useful, and as you said, I've dealt with it more successfully than most. Given that, I think you'll want to understand why. I listed my virtues. Victoria and I are still married 4 years after your half-brother Lee left for college, and we plan to stay together until the end. We had another child 3 years after Lee left, so it's not just convenience, it's love. We're both loyal to each other, and neither of us have had an affair. I grinned. Except, of course, the clear one. Victoria's smile grew brighter, and I met her gaze with a supportive expression as I continued. Almost all of our friends divorced when their children reached 18, and those who stayed married did so for convenience rather than love. None of them kept what we have in marriage. If that doesn't matter to you, think of the 2 people who didn't survive. Sure, Franklin was a failure, but he wasn't the best choice for the experiment. Tig, on the other hand... I shrugged. He seemed like the perfect candidate, but we all saw how that turned out. The 10th member of our club waited for his wife to return from a trip and then shot her when she opened the door and then killed himself. Richard seemed unfazed by this argument. You have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, he remarked. That's true, I agreed, but people are not eggs. If you break an egg wrong, the worst thing that can happen is a dirty countertop. Franklin and Teague both broke the egg wrong, and only they and Mrs. Teague got hurt. But what if a man endures in silence? What if he hides his pain, waiting for the moment when he can voice his displeasure, perhaps next year on summer vacation, perhaps directing his anger at you or at all of us? The faculty know these buildings well, and it wouldn't be hard for a man dissatisfied with his position to hide a weapon, or worse, blow something up. I grinned with self-irony. Yeah, every one of us has thought about that. That first night, even that first year, we all hated your father, our wives, the college, and the switch they put in our house. We all dreamed of revenge. It was only natural. The psychological profiles your father invested in did select men who could come to terms with his actions, but that process takes time. Even if the profile is accurate, catching the right man at the wrong time can lead to, well, let's call it unintended consequences. Seeing the dubious expression on his face, I changed the subject. Besides, you certainly want your children to thrive. While I don't mean to boast, Lee excels academically over your father's other children. We are proud of his accomplishments and would like to see the same results from your children. He finally nodded. Pride was proving to be as powerful a motivator for him as it was for his father. Wonderful. I knew you cared as much for your offspring as your father cared for all of his. Richard frowned, but said nothing. Jeremy, as expected, was glowing with a smile. I got into the rhythm of the lecture like old slippers. Let's start with the first year or so. As I said, it's a critical period. Unless you count Franklin, Teague, and Martin, my colleagues and I have traveled a similar path to acceptance, although each of us went through the stages in a different order. First, the anger. How dare that rich bastard do this to us? I'm going to kill him. I'll kill her. I'll burn down the college. Of course it's stupid. As you correctly pointed out, your father had us on a short leash, but it was a natural reaction and a necessary part of the process, as was our anger at those who came before, but failed to achieve their revenge. If they had succeeded, we would not have had to endure this humiliation. However, the fact that there were others suffering as we did was the reason for our survival. The men your father cuckolded became reliant on each other for support, understanding, and guidance on how to move on. Most of us continued to grieve. At first, we grieved the strong marriages we thought we had built, the accomplishments we were so proud of, and the future that no longer existed. But it wasn't until Professor Klein joined our group a year after me that we began to mourn the right things. Klein, the first philosopher in our group, helped us better understand the nature of what we had lost. Your father didn't rob us of happy marriages or promising careers. Instead, he only stole illusions from us. In retrospect, this may seem like a simple realization, but it strengthened us as individuals and as a whole group. Seeing the empty glasses on the table, I paused to refill them. Neither Charlotte nor I drank alcohol. I filled the glasses with water, took a long sip, and returned to the story. Then we got to the avoidance and denial stage. Most of us took up hobbies that allowed us to stay home, to vent our aggression, or at least feel like we were reclaiming our masculinity. Our wives, knowing that success depended on our consent, assisted in this. Huh, Victoria? My wife blushed and giggled in response to my playful attention. Personally, I delved into community theater and long-distance running, while others found solace in martial arts, rugby, and other activities. However, although motivation helped us to some extent, we still had to find ways to cope, and hobbies could only provide a temporary distraction. In the end, we coped, as always, through the discipline we had dedicated our lives to. Psychologists parsed the behavior of the participants, trying to find explanations for why one of the richest men on the planet had embarked on such an extravagant adventure, why our normal, loving wives supported him, and why we didn't fight back more vigorously. Philosophers speculated about the moral and ethical implications for each player. Linguists. Well, the linguists were a bit on the sidelines, to be honest. The etymology of the word cuckold is well known, but they were successful in their work with children under their supervision, and the length of their marriages after the children reached adulthood spoke volumes about the quality of that work. Despite this, we tried to work together, striving to overcome all obstacles as a united group, from start to finish. If any of us had faced this situation alone, it would have been like a blind man trying to describe an elephant. In a way, we remained the same. My theory, though understood by the rest of us, was not recognized by everyone. It alienated me from many of them, especially after I had fully immersed myself in it. However, given my success, I remained true to my fanaticism. Richard snorted. Okay, what is your solution? What did you do that was so different from the others? I raised my hand to ask him to be quiet. Patience. We'll get to it. We still have all evening. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Provided the storm doesn't carry us away. I glanced at Charlotte. Donato was closest to me. Did you know that? She finished her sip of water and smiled calmly. No, I'm afraid that... Well, my role has always been to deliver bad news. You know none of the professors have ever approached me sincerely. I shrugged. True. But if it's any consolation, I think your being there really helped. We got someone we immediately hated, both in time and proximity. And frankly, we hated you. I even thought Smythe was going to kill you years ago, until the three of us captured him. She smiled, but only faintly. Like I said, Donato told me the following. You should think of it as droit du seigneur. Jeremy laughed, a short, ugly laugh. He got the point. Charlotte seemed to, too. Richard and Victoria, on the other hand, looked at me with bewilderment. The term, also known as prima nocta, refers to the supposed practice of medieval nobles. On the wedding night, a peasant couple would give a lord, baron, or other nobleman the opportunity to spend the first night with the bride. Donato argued that we are in the same situation as the men whose wives were taken away by the nobles. We can try to fight, but it will most likely only lead to the destruction of our lives, and in the worst-case scenario, our deaths. Besides, he said, the children of these connections and the families in which they grew up often received gifts and privileges from the biological father. His position was, put your head down, do the bare minimum, take what you can get, and walk away. That's exactly what he did. Divorced when his son turned 18, got his share, and retired to sail around the world. Many in our group did the same. His arguments were quite compelling. Given Jeremy's outstanding genes, I can only attribute the number of college dropouts and criminals among Richard's half-siblings to my colleague's conviction in this philosophy, especially given the high success rate of the biological children of those same professors. In fact, given our success with Lee, I'd almost guarantee it. The look on Jeremy's face was sad at first, but improved when I mentioned my son. I chewed the inside of my cheek slowly, deciding how to proceed, a nervous habit I'd never been able to get rid of, no matter how many years I tried. At first, I found it compelling, and even planned to proceed as Donato suggested. However, something in the very concept of this strategy caused me doubts, some misunderstanding. Finally, I realized there was no such thing as droit du seigneur. It may have occurred occasionally when a nobleman wanted to take a peasant woman as his wife, but that was rather the exception. When such a phenomenon is mentioned in historical sources, it is always something that happened over there to someone else. The English claimed that the French aristocracy took wives from among the serfs. Herodotus claimed it was a practice among the Adermachids, and so on. I pointed this out to Jordan, and he basically shrugged and said it was probably a myth, but could still be instructive. When he said myth, the thought of lightning came to my mind, if you'll allow me that pun. Nobles from the times about which written records survive have used myths to justify their right to power, from the divine right of kings to the Egyptians' claim that they were descendants of gods, or even gods themselves. That was the view of your father, Richard, and of you, as gods. Everyone around the table looked at me as if I had lost my mind, so I quickly added, not literally, I'm not going to build a temple in my backyard in Jeremy's honor. But, I pointed my hand toward the house we were in a way, it's the same thing. I would never have been able to afford such a gorgeous vacation home without his generosity. If he had wanted to, he could have taken my wife from me and offered nothing in return but contempt and threat. But instead, he gifted me with more money than most men need, and the opportunity to pursue the things I love in exchange for sacrifice. Though, as you told me that first night, Charlotte, that's far from a small sacrifice to be made by many men. Richard snorted. So, Daddy is God. Does that mean I'm Jesus? I grinned, giving my words a slight sneer. Well, not exactly. I think of you more as Greek gods. The Greeks, and many pre-Christian cultures, saw their gods as embodiments of natural or cultural forces they couldn't control or understand, but at the same time saw them as beings like humans, only more. They were more powerful, of course, but also possessed more pronounced passions, appetites, and so on. They, of course, also engaged in the 4 F's of life: fighting, fleeing, eating, and mating, but they did it on a much grander level. Jeremy looked intrigued and even a little amused, but his son continued to shake his head. That's absurd. I pointed at the man who'd foisted his child on me. If your father wanted to, he could follow my steps at all hours of the day and night, destroy me with a single word, ruin my career, kill me, imprison me, or otherwise punish me. Could he shower me with wealth, women, success, and fame? We both know the answer to that question, and all of these things he could have done simply by exerting his power. What could I do to him, even if I gave my life for it? Kill him? Maybe. But at best, I'll be known as the madman who killed the billionaire philanthropist, and after his death, they'll exalt him. How many followers does he have on social media who accept his words as truth? How many otherwise reasonable and rational people are willing to go on a killing spree on his orders, despite the fact that he's just a successful businessman? In another time, in other circumstances, would we call that worship? This is evident even in the decree he gave me and my colleagues. Raise my children in a stable family and keep your contact with me secret, and I will reward you. He offered no contract, no specific instructions, no way to verify that we were following his request other than on pure intuition. It was not an agreement to be understood. It was an order to be obeyed, or else. Your father is not a noble lord. He is not a king who claims divine descent, nor is he a politician who utters platitudes about God, though he hardly believes it himself. He follows laws only when it benefits him, and forces people to make laws that suit his interests. The only people who can truly oppose him are other gods, people with similar power and wealth, who conspire among themselves to avoid undermining their own power. If you combine all these facts, what can you call such a person other than God? So, Richard thought about it, frowning, but then smiled when he realized the implications. So, we're gods, right? Me and him? Yes, I confirmed, grinning. I'd rather compare you to the Greek gods Zeus and his son Ares. Charlotte choked on her water, halfway down her throat. Victoria patted her back, making soothing noises, until Miss Green spoke up. I apologize, wrong drink, and waved her hand, inviting me to continue. Zeus's favorite wife, Hera, bore him Ares, but the king of the Olympian gods was a real seducer. He had many other children, about 100, and also many women. Usually, though not always, children born to gods from other gods or mythological beings also became gods, but those born to mortal women were considered demigods. Among them were the worst, such as Narcissus, who was so narcissistic that we even invented a psychological concept out of it, and the best, whom we still revere today, Jason, Orion, Hippolytus, and of course Heracles, or perhaps you know him by his Roman name of Hercules. I took another sip from my glass to quench my thirst. Even after years of lecturing, I always wanted a drink. Once I accepted this reality that Jeremy could be a god, I realized that the only sensible move was to accept my position. Even kings realized that it was best not to confront the gods, at least the ones that thought with their heads. For example, Minos lived in blessed abundance until he refused to sacrifice a particularly magnificent bull to Poseidon, whereupon the wrath of the gods fell upon him. His wife, Pasiphae, was forced by Poseidon to mate with this bull. In some versions, she could no longer be satisfied with Minos. As a result of this union, Pasiphae gave birth to a monstrous minotaur, which Minos imprisoned in a labyrinth until the human hero, Theseus, finished him off. I didn't want to be Minos, cursed for failing to sacrifice, and spend a miserable life until I was rid of the monster living under my roof. Instead, I decided to become Amphitryon, the man who raised Hercules. Amphitryon, also a king, was tricked into kidnapping by Zeus. He could have rejected his offspring as other men have done in similar situations, but instead he chose to raise Heracles as his own, teaching him to be a warrior like his adoptive father and balancing his Olympian predispositions. Once I envisioned myself as Amphitryon, everything else fell into place. Amphitryon and his wife Alcmene remained together until his death, and they had another child. His kingdom prospered, and he raised one of the greatest heroes of all time. Did I have to sacrifice anything for that? Of course. But, as Professor Klein helped me realize, the only thing I really sacrificed was my illusions. That's the secret of my success. I didn't just admit my powerlessness before a modern Greek god. I accepted it, and in return I got everything I could ever want: wealth, a loving wife, a successful career, and recognition from my peers. My biological children, with the exception of my youngest, are already successful, and I'm sure Lee is as well. The public will never know that my Hercules has a different father, so his exploits will at least partially be a reflection of me. Why would I be unhappy with that outcome? Richard remarks mockingly, because your wife slept with another man. Richard, I thought Jeremy might punch him, but instead he turned to me. Stephen, I'm so sorry. I admit that I disappointed you with my behavior. My son and I are going to have a long conversation about this. I brushed off his concern. He's young. At his age, I was like that too. In time, Richard will realize that occasional infidelity matters little. After all, wives cheat on their husbands all the time. It happens to the best of us, don't you agree? Jeremy frowned thoughtfully, as if remembering something from long ago, then smiled a smile that didn't touch his eyes and laughed. Agreed. Picking up my bowl, I asked, "Dessert?" While we enjoyed the creme brulee, the conversation turned to other topics, and we laughed and joked while I poured wine and carried out my threat to fill my belly with dessert. Afterward, we moved to the study, where the three men, joined by Charlotte, were plotting how Richard would cuckold my protege, a young professor of classical studies, whom I liked very much. By then the storm outside had turned into a gale, but we paid little attention to its fury. Normally, Charlotte would have gone home, but we had enough room for everyone, and since Jeremy and Richard intended to stay the night, another guest would not be out of place. In the middle of the night, the first of our group fell ill. Victoria barely made it to the restroom before food poisoning caught up with her. When she threw up a third time, she didn't have the strength to get up from the cool floor tiles. I managed to help her into bed, but I got sick too and barely made it back to the restroom in time. Throughout the night, all of us, including Alex, suffered from the same symptoms. By morning, however, they were mostly gone, leaving only fatigue and a vague sense of nausea. Victoria's apology was followed by assurances that our guests had nothing to do with it. Even so, it was time for Stoll's entourage to hit the road for the annual African safari that always followed one of these dinners. 3 days later, Victoria and I were again faced with severe stomach cramps and vomiting, even worse than before. I immediately called the emergency services, and the paramedics rushed us both to the hospital. Victoria's symptoms became even more severe than mine, and we were placed in different rooms. The doctors began to investigate the cause of our condition, and the look on the face of one of them, who visited me after the cause was found, told me everything. He cautiously asked, "Could it be that you or your wife ate some forest mushrooms in the last few days?" "Victoria was making mushroom risotto last weekend. She usually uses mushrooms from the store, but sometimes she picks them from the surrounding woods." My face expressed horror and understanding. I knew that amatoxin poisoning causes liver and kidney failure, starting with vomiting and diarrhea, followed by a brief period of relief when the symptoms disappear. But this period is deceptive. Like radiation poisoning, the damage has already been done and the body stops signaling a problem. I also knew that psilocybin, taken before consuming the Amanita bisporigera mushroom, could slightly mitigate the effects of amatoxin. I exclaimed indignantly, "But she's been collecting mushrooms for years. How could this have happened? She has a biology degree, for crying out loud." The elderly doctor sighed. "It's a pretty easy mistake to make. Even experts make mistakes sometimes. That's why we recommend that people don't." He stopped. "Did anyone else have risotto?" "We had a few guests. Charlotte Green, Brewham's Vice President of Development, Jeremy and Richard Stoll." The doctor's eyebrows rose. "And their security guard, Alex, but they're overseas right now, on safari in Africa." "Mr. Marcheno, are the Josts friends of yours?" "Yes, at least Jeremy is." I clenched my teeth, feeling a rush of nausea. "He's a donor to the university." The doctor sighed. "I'm sorry to inform you of this, but Jeremy Stoll passed away last night. It was reported on the news this morning. No reasons were given, but... Oh, God. I tried to get up, but I felt sick to my stomach. Doctor, I must see my wife. I'm afraid I can't let you do that, Mr. Marcheno. You need to rest, and your wife. Unfortunately, your wife is in a coma. The next day, Charlotte also ended up in the hospital, with the same symptoms. The police soon arrived, although the doctors were careful to rule out interference from the authorities. The deaths of Jeremy, then Alex, and a day later Richard, made the case look like a murder, especially as only one person from the dinner guests had escaped serious liver damage and almost none from kidney damage. I tried to be as open as possible in telling them about the strange taste of the food, which Victoria could have confirmed if she had woken up. But that didn't happen. She died the same day as Richard, around the time I regained a bit of consciousness. Upon learning of her death, I openly expressed my grief, shedding tears at the injustice of what had happened. Family friends alerted our children, who began packing up to go home. As soon as I felt a little better, I wanted to leave the hospital and go home, not to the house where we had spent that horrible weekend. I would never want to go back there again. But just as I was about to leave, one of the nurses informed me that Charlotte wanted to see me in her room. After everything that had happened, of course I went. Otherwise it might have seemed suspicious. As I entered her room, I saw that she was talking to a man I hardly recognized. "Charlotte, you can't..." Even through the pain, her voice sounded dismissive. "I can, and I will." Then she turned to me, trying to smile. "Stephen, thank you for coming. This is Anthony Atkins, my attorney." Atkins, an older man with a gray beard, nodded at me. "Mr. Marcheno." I returned the nod and turned to Charlotte. "Charlotte, I'm so sorry." She laughed. "Really?" I opened my mouth to reply, but she turned to her lawyer. "Give him this, and then you can leave." Seeing his hesitation, she repeated, "Go. I'm a big girl, Jerry. Please do what I say." Atkins stroked her hand, smiled sadly, and walked over to me. He had 2 envelopes in his hands, one of which he handed to me and held the other in front of my face. "After Miss Green is dead, I will give this to the police. If you touch her, sir, Jerry..." He looked at her. "It's all right. He won't do anything to me. Even if he did, I'd deserve it. Stephen's a good man, and even if he finds out what I did, I can't imagine him attacking a dying woman. He'll just wait. Please close the door behind you." The lawyer gave me another warning look before agreeing to her request. When he left, I tried to apologize again. "Charlotte, I apologize for..." She raised her hand, shutting my mouth, and pointed to a chair. "Read this, and then we'll talk." I sat down, opening the envelope and reading it. "To whom it may concern, I, Charlotte Green, confess to the well-deserved premeditated murders of Jeremy Stoll, Richard Stoll, and Alex Ivish. To my eternal shame, I also confess to the murder of Victoria Marcheno and grievous bodily harm to my friend, Stephen Marcheno. I hope when he reads this, he can forgive me. Jeremy Stoll has physically, emotionally, and sexually abused me throughout my career, both when I worked directly for him and later after becoming his liaison at Brougham University. He threatened to destroy my career if I did not submit to whatever sick perversions he wanted to subject me to, and to harm my family and friends if I tried to leave or go to the police. I contemplated suicide, but Jeremy assured me that he would see it as a voluntary resignation and would retaliate against my loved ones. Jeremy also promised that after retirement I would be free. I believed it, but recently he announced that he would be handing over my slave contract, as he called it, to his son Richard, along with the business. I realized then that only his death or mine could set me free, and I would not give him any more opportunity to cause suffering. I don't regret his death, but I can't forgive myself for Victoria's death and Stephen's suffering. A few weeks before dinner, I suggested Victoria make mushroom risotto, intending to slip poisonous mushrooms into Jeremy and Richard's bowls in hopes of a tragic accident. Unfortunately, Jeremy was more alert. He wouldn't let me help serve the food, and I panicked. Jeremy planned to announce his retirement upon his return with his son from safari. Fearing that I wouldn't be able to organize another attempt, I poisoned the entire pot by leaving while the salad was being served. I pray that Victoria will forgive me, and that Jeremy, Richard, and Alex pay for their crimes. Along with this letter, my attorney will present evidence of Jeremy's abuse and financial fraud, as well as documents to back up my words. May God have mercy on my soul. Charlotte Green. I look skeptically at Charlotte, the woman in front of me, and the disgusting stole dog that ruled my life. She smiled weakly upon hearing my words and uttered, "I'm glad it was you." A sudden wave of tension shot through me, but she only laughed mockingly. "Don't worry, I don't expect a confession from you. You've deceived us well enough as it is, and I'm sure you're not going to reveal your cards." Folding the paper and putting it back in the envelope, I replied, "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you do. You've kept your mask splendidly, you know. Mr. Stoll had complete faith in your loyalty to the very end, and he was mocking you the whole time. He was a real monster, his friendly, benevolent mask. It was just a deception. But now, as you've noticed, he was a Nazi pervert. How nice to say that out loud, knowing you have nothing to fear." I only shrugged. "Jeremy was a complicated person." Charlotte was silent for a long moment, then said slowly, "Pretending for so long is exhausting. I've had to pretend too, but only in his presence. But you—" She looked out the window. "My God, what you've been through. What we put you through. You haven't had a moment to yourself. You've had to maintain a facade in front of your wife, your children, endure the bullying of coworkers who think you're a traitor. I at least had some privacy at home, even if it was a solitary life. Mr. Stoll made sure that was the case. Charlotte suddenly froze. Her face contorted into an unusual manic smile that soon turned into laughter interrupted by spasms of pain. I watched this with some satisfaction until she calmed down enough to continue. "Even now, I still maintain my mask. Mr. Stoll, it's hard to call the devil by his name, but he was the devil, and I sold my soul to him. I'm not interested in your tossing around, Charlotte." I stood up, and she demonstrated her ability to live with the hassle. "Wait. Please, Stephen. I accept responsibility for you. Shouldn't that be encouraged?" Unable to contain my anger, even for a moment, I growled, "You deserve nothing. I owe you nothing." Then, realizing my weakness and frightened at how easily I was giving in, I regained control and said calmly, "I came here in respect for my colleague, but after you killed my wife, I don't see—" Charlotte suddenly experienced difficulty breathing. "What? You—" She tried to untie the knots on her robe. "Stop it. I don't know what you're up to, but you have to—" The robe slipped off, causing me to freeze in mute amazement. Charlotte had probably once been beautiful. Her face still held beauty, but the mature, lived-in beauty of a woman in her 50s. Her body was still slender, catching my attention, as it had years ago when I first met her, before I knew what her master was up to. However, it was all marred by uneven scars of varying shapes and sizes that stretched across almost her entire torso. In some places, the deep scars had torn away chunks of her flesh. In others, the scars resembled winding paths or riverbeds. The age of these wounds varied too, and her body looked like a patchwork of gray, mottled pieces of skin. She smiled sadly, seeing my astonished look, and whispered, "I too have experienced much suffering. Perhaps not as you have, but I too have hidden my suffering, just as you have." "Stoll did that to you?" I asked. "In a way," Charlotte replied, tucking her hands back into her dress and beginning to button it. I had no one I could rely on, no one who understood me. As cruel as he was to you and your coworkers, you had a friend for support. You had your children and, strangely, your wives. It may not have meant much, but it was better than nothing at all." Tying up her robe, Charlotte laid back on the bed, painting a face of discomfort. "I started working at Stoll's firm right out of college. I progressed through the ranks faster than I should have, to be honest. I thought I had caught his attention with my skills and energy, but all along he had been following me. He came to me and told me that he had a special project he wanted me to work on for a few years, and that if I agreed, he would let me leave. I would have been a fool not to take up the offer, so I signed a non-disclosure agreement. Only then did he tell me about my role. I didn't like what he was up to, but he assured me that it was for the common good, and that the psychological profiles he had compiled ensured that he would only choose men who could easily put up with what he intended to do to them. So, I agreed. I was too young and naive then. Donato was the first, and he did pretty well. Not perfectly, but well, and even succeeded. I told Stoll that I wasn't comfortable with it. Charlotte nodded. The psychologists in his file wrote that he would do something terrible. I went to Stoll and told him about it, but he replied that he had his own plans for Franklin and that I should trust him. Jeremy can be persuasive, charismatic, and he's always treated me with the respect I've craved since I became that stuck-up black lesbian, as one of my high school rivals once called me. You only knew him as the one who ruined your life. To me, he was a hero, and my hero said things would get better. So I believed him. I went with him, and then Franklin actually did what the profiles predicted, except they never said he would kill himself. I stormed into Stoll's office, and he just laughed. What did you expect from a subhuman? He couldn't stand the pressure. People like you never do. He mocked me, said that I was complicit in all this, and that if I tried to go to the police or the press, he would make sure that all the threats he heaped on his underlings would be a double burden on me. Then he said something that put fear in me. Be a good little Negro and know your place. If you can do that, perhaps one day I'll play along with you and yours myself. Lord, sighed I. Charlotte nodded, tears flashing in her eyes. Then she took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and covered her face with her hand. The mask I'd seen for years was back. I always wanted children, but I wouldn't let it touch me, so I signed up for surgery. I broke up with my girlfriend too, and since then, I've only had casual hookups, but not long enough to give Stoll another trump card. I cut myself off from my friends, but remained a connection to my family for him. There was nothing I could do to comfort those he hurt, except become hateful to them, so I did. Every night I read a speech addressed to one of those he attacked. Then I went home and... Her words froze, a gesture toward the mangled body speaking for itself. It's a completely different pain than just feeling trapped for years. But if each of you were to experience this sharp, unexpected agony, I decided I had to try it on myself. God, how I wanted to kill him, and how I wanted to kill myself. What I wrote in the letter is true to some extent. Not about the sexual assault, thank God. I made it up to get attention. Stoll made it clear that if I decided to kill myself, he would simply find someone else for his sick experiment, a new puppet to abuse, and his anger at my weakness would be taken out on my family as easily as it would be on me if I left. And I realized that if I killed Jeremy, Richard would avenge him, even though he hates his father. She laughed. You were great, by the way. At that dinner, I mean. Just sat there and insulted them to their faces the whole time, and they listened to it like it was a brilliant line. Zeus and Ares. God, I just laughed, barely holding on to my chair. A predatory father with the morals of a 2-year-old and his cruel, bloodthirsty son. And these stories about how Jeremy cared so much for his children, even leaving Richard in the care of nannies and tutors? God, I thought, that little bastard is going to anger me. I allowed myself a small smile, and it made her laugh again. What about the fact that all the other Jeremys turned out to be losers, except the one you tutored? That was brilliant. I shrugged. It was unnecessary, I guess. Maybe so, but it was nice. I can't agree or disagree. Her sudden laughter turned to coughing. When it subsided, I handed her the glass of water I'd filled while she fought the fit. She smiled in gratitude and drank deeply, then said, I realized you weren't what I thought you were to Jeremy, but I couldn't understand why you took the risk that night. When we pretended to be poisoned by the food, I thought you had done something more, but... She shook her head. Then when I found out Victoria was in the hospital and Jeremy was dead, I realized everything. I mean, I realized not only what you did, but why. why you became hated among your coworkers, why you had another child with your wife, why you started being friends with Jeremy, all of it. Even your choice of hobbies, long-running workouts so you'd have time to think things through alone, and theater classes to learn how to communicate with others. Charlotte smiled conspiratorially. Stoll installed microphones in my office, you know. He liked to play recordings of men talking and made me listen to them with him, showing his real nature. Then he would destroy the tapes. I guess keeping secrets or controlling information was his hobby. I still remember Abernathy's words the night I informed you that Victoria and Stoll had left on his plane. He said that Stoll had chosen a group of patient, methodical people to victimize them. And now, one of those people has shown him how expensive his arrogance has become by using their own qualities against him. Her voice grew thinner, penetrating melancholy. I wish we could be friends. I think maybe, if our lives had worked out differently, we could have been. You know, I'm into mythology too. Back in college, I regretted choosing a path in business. I can't apologize to you. I would never do it because I don't know if I could forgive you if I were you. And you're right, you don't owe me anything, but I'd still like to ask a favor. I looked at her with some suspicion. What kind of favor? Nothing in particular. She was having trouble speaking. It's hard. It hurts me to exist, but I've gotten used to this pain, and I'm ready to leave. I guess it won't be too soon, and I'm even glad of it. But can you tell me a story, one of your favorites? Maybe I don't deserve to be comforted, but I'll ask anyway. Part of me, most of me, wanted to get up and leave without saying another word. No matter how it fell under Stoll's influence, it was helping him torment me. The other part, the much smaller part, wanted to apologize. But I couldn't do that, at least not now. That left the last biggest part, the part that saw her as some kind of soulmate, a monster created by someone else's designs, but ultimately trying to be a hero, or perhaps a hero who was forced by circumstances to become a monster. Softly, as if telling a bedtime story, I asked, "This will be a new story, a new myth. Is that okay with you? A new one?" Students come to my classes for a variety of reasons, but most often because of movies or books. The Disney movie about Hercules, for example, or the Wonder Woman comics. These are valid starting points. After all, the Greeks had many different versions of their own mythology. More recently, however, many people have told me about a game called Hades. I made one of my kids play it once because it's so damn hard. Charlotte chuckled. I figured out why. It's a beautifully rendered version of the old myths put through modern sensibilities. I'd like to tell you a story from Hades. Would you mind? Charlotte nodded. Please. I'd really like that. Taking a deep breath, I began. Long ago, in the time of ancient Greece, the hero Theseus died after a long life filled with adventure. After his death, he, like all mortals, traveled to the underworld. Because Theseus was a king and a hero, Hades, the god of the dead, sent him to Elysium, a realm where the worthy could indulge in endless pleasures. However, he soon grew bored with this easy afterlife. He learned that his old enemy and the fiercest fighter he had ever faced, Asterius the Minotaur, resided in Erebus, a region of darkness where slain beasts dwell. Theseus, excited at the prospect of fighting the monster he had once slain, left the Elysian fields and traveled across the Styx in search of him. When Theseus found Asterius, it was not a wild, maddened monster that stood before the Greek king. While the Minotaur retained his bestial features, Theseus found a penitent, soft-spoken creature. When the hero drew his sword, Asterius did not fight, but forgave Theseus for killing him and sending him to the realm of eternal darkness. Theseus paused at the Minotaur's words, lowering his weapon. Both recounted how each of them had reached their first battle. Theseus as a hero who had chosen to sacrifice himself for his homeland to repay the Minoans for the battle his father had lost, and Asterius as a monster cursed by the god Poseidon before he was even born, all because of the actions of his father, King Minos. Each of them, human and monster, found themselves pawns in larger plans they had no control over. After sitting together, they learned that they had much in common and parted as friends. Eventually, Theseus visited Asterius again, making a request to Hades on behalf of his strange new friend. This time, the hero brought an invitation to join him in Elysium, where they could fight together in the arena, now as allies rather than enemies. Charlotte, with tears streaming down her face, smiled gratefully and closed her eyes. Lowering her head one last time, she whispered, "Thank you, Theseus." I patted her hand lightly. "Rest well, Asterius." During the night, she died. The next day, her lawyer turned over her confession and all the evidence she had gathered to the FBI, the IRS, and the press. After that, the wolves came down to earth. Some went to jail, others made deals, and Stoll's property was sold to the Fauve, the Hasso Arfatre, the highest bidder, or confiscated by the authorities. I killed Stoll, and Charlotte spat on his corpse. Brome weathered the storm, but only barely. Money dried up. A huge chunk of the administration was out of work, and nearly 20 respected liberal arts professors quit almost immediately after Stoll's death was announced. The school had once again become the laughingstock it had been before its benefactor turned it into the site of his own little eugenics experiment. Speaking of his monstrous attempt to gamble with our lives, the investigation found not even a hint of its existence. A few emails popped up here and there, but almost entirely out of context. If Stoll or his staff kept any records, they never surfaced. And given that Charlotte confirmed that the whole thing was just a way for him to have fun, they probably didn't exist at all. As for my own children, they were mourning their mother. I did too, to some extent. Victoria's death had touched me more than I expected. Keeping a pure hatred for Jeremy was easy, since I saw him very rarely. The same could be said for Alex. Toward Charlotte, too, before her exposure. I could avoid her on campus most of the time. I only killed Richard because it was clear he was planning to follow in his father's footsteps, but I feel no more remorse over his death than I do over the death of a rabid dog. Victoria, on the other hand, leaves me feeling ambivalent. As Charlotte quickly found out, I threw myself into community theater to hone my acting skills. Even that first night, I decided that no matter what I did, I would pretend to be the best husband I could be, because my children deserved it. I also decided that no amount of trying to make amends would mitigate the wounds she had inflicted, and that, too, proved to be true. Unfortunately, having succumbed to the illusion of my love for her, I occasionally discovered warm feelings for my unfaithful wife. We've all heard stories of two actors falling in love with each other during the filming of a movie, and I finally realized through experience how it happens. I strive to play my love for her without bringing it into reality because the third thing I decided that night was that I would get out of our marriage as soon as I could, just like Donato suggested. In the end, I found a middle ground, though it may seem vile, perhaps not as vile as murder, but those plans came later. Instead, I chose to view Victoria as a pet to be affectioned and enjoyed, even guilt-ridden for leaving her behind, but not as a real person worthy of deep, abiding love. She has already proven herself not to be one, at least in my eyes. However, my muted affection made it harder for me to kill her, and I felt sadness at her death. If I hadn't realized later, I would have just divorced her, but in the end it turned out that I really did need her until the very end. She would have been the perfect target if Charlotte hadn't thrown herself on her sword. What I said to Stoll was partly true. I did consider him a god on earth, in the sense I'd told him about, one of the monstrous deities of ancient religions who played with humans and had humans as toys for them. It was only after Klein and his deep immersion in philosophy, or rather, he and I were absorbed in Nietzsche's philosophy together, that I remembered an important thing. Gods can be killed. We've been doing it for almost as long as they've existed. The Olympians destroyed the Titans, after one Proto-Indo-European tribe defeated another. The Romans forced the Greeks into submission and, like good Romans, allowed the Greeks to keep their gods. However, they renamed them, making Zeus, king of the gods, Juno, protector of the state. Christians destroyed the Roman gods, though their images continue to live on in iconography and pop culture. Depictions of the god as a bearded man clutching a lightning bolt in his hand. Dante's circles of hell, holidays, dates, and rituals that happen to coincide with Roman ones. No one worships their gods, however, except for a few advanced types, just as no one worships Stoll anymore, except for a few particularly misguided members of his cult of personality. The conversation with Klein while intoxicated planted a seed, and my suppressed rage blossomed into full bluster. I realized that the gods could die, and I decided to kill one of them. That thought turned Victoria from a beloved wife into a potential weapon of my vengeance. Everything that followed, the birth of our youngest child, the continuation of our marriage, the entreaties of Charlotte and Stoll to weaken his defenses, all of it, with the exception of my sincere love for my children, was directed towards that goal. I may be called crazy, and perhaps that is true, but I have not always been crazy. It is said that those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make insane. Perhaps it works the other way around. Who but the insane would dare oppose a god? Who but we, Charlotte and I, in our madness, could succeed? I wish I had known that she could be my ally, that she was my ally. Had I realized that, had we become friends and even allies, maybe we could have mitigated the madness that was pushing us toward destruction. Who knows? Maybe someday we will meet in Elysium or Erebus and make a decision there, together, in a realm where heroes and monsters live forever.